Hello and welcome to the Business Talk podcast. I'm your host Deepak. We are delighted to welcome Professor Michael Morris to our podcast episode. Professor Michael Morris holds the Cheng Professorship of Leadership at Columbia Business School and is also a professor in Columbia University's Psychology Department. A renowned educator, he teaches MBA and executive level courses in leadership, teamwork, negotiation, communication, and decision making, including the core MBA class, lead, and innovative elective, The Leader's Voice, which earned him the Dean's Award for Curriculum Innovation in 2016. A prolific researcher, Professor Morris has published over 200 articles in top behavioral science and management journals. His groundbreaking work in cultural psychology and decision making has received numerous international awards across disciplines such as social psychology, marketing, and management. His research explores cultural cognition, decision making, social networks, and negotiation. At Columbia, Professor Morris has made significant contributions by founding initiatives like the Leadership Lab and the Behavioral Lab, focusing on developing social intelligence and fostering behavioral science research. He has been served as a consulting editor for journals such as Journal of International Business and Management and Organization Review and has held associate editor roles at prominent publications. Before joining Columbia in 2001, Professor Morris was a tenured professor at Stanford's Graduate School of Business and Psychology Department. He has also held visiting professorships at esteemed institutions including Harvard Business School, INSEAD, and the University of Hong Kong. Professor Michael Morris holds a PhD from the University of Michigan and a BA from Brown University. In this episode, Professor Morris will dwell into insights from his latest book, Tribal: How the Primal Cultural Instincts That Divide Us Can Help Bring Us Together. Professor Michael Morris, it's an honor and privilege to have you join us today.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. It's great to I don't think I've been on a podcast based in India before, so I'm really thrilled to reach a new audience.
Thank you, Professor Morris. First of all,
Hmm.
congratulations, Professor Morris, on Tribal being shortlisted for the Business Book Award sponsored by the Financial Times and Schroders.
Yeah, thank you. I recently was in London for the award ceremony, and it was very fun. It was like a miniature version of the Academy Awards, with a lot of suspense and a lot of celebrities. So it was really fun.
Yeah. Professor, what inspired you to write Tribal and explore the concept of tribal instincts as humanity's secret weapon?
Uh, yeah, the reasons for writing the book, there are really two basic reasons. One is that I've been teaching business leaders, business students and executives, for decades now about culture and how to lead through culture and how to take culture into account when you're negotiating. And I've found that most people have a very fuzzy notion of what culture is and how cultural psychology works. So I've developed a playbook, a toolkit for trying to help people understand culture and understand where the levers are. But at the same time, while writing this book, I've noticed that there's a new or a rising way of talking about the conflicts in our society as resulting from tribalism, and it's usually a discourse that is framed in a very despairing way, like this this cursed gene of tribalism has somehow reawoken, and there's nothing we can do about it, and it's dooming our democracy, and it's dooming our international comity, and it's dooming our large organizations, and everything is splintering. And so it's a sort of fatalistic trope that the pundits have been developing. And I wanted to counter that because it's not a way of thinking about tribalism that is very based on research about tribal instincts. And there is research about tribal instincts, and it is pretty clear about what the tribal instincts that define humans they are mostly us instincts. They are not mostly them instincts. They are mostly instincts for solidarity, not instincts for hostility or animosity.
Tribalism is often viewed negatively in our society. How do you redefine this concept and why do you believe it is misunderstood?
Well, I believe it's misunderstood because the, colloquially, the word tribalistic is often used as an insult. It's often used as a way of telling somebody that they're being irrational, that they're prioritizing their group above all things in an irrational way. And I think that that is, not the heart of what tribal psychology is. Tribal psychology is the set of brain adaptations that emerged during the Stone Age and enabled our species to start a different kind of social living than any other primate species. Other primate species live in very small groups, like chimpanzees live in a group of 30 or 40 individuals, and they're incapable of living in large groups. Larger groups descend into a bloody conflict. And we developed these instincts for sharing culture in our groups, and then culture became a glue that enabled groups to grow, from 30 to 300 to 3,000 and then 30,000, 300,000,000, 3 billion, and we benefit enormously from being able to live as part of large communities and to live in these nested communities where we live in smaller groups and larger groups at the same time. And so all of this comes from our tribal psychology. Now, our tribal psychology can go awry, and that does contribute to conflicts. And that's more obvious when it's happening. So we notice tribal psychology when it's going awry. We don't notice it so much when it's working adaptively because a lot of it is happening unconsciously. We feel an unconscious loyalty to our group. We unconsciously make reference to ideas that we know somebody else just shares with us because of being a member of the same culture, and that helps us understand each other and it helps us coordinate. And we do all of this on autopilot without thinking about it. So, tribalism has a bad name. It's sort of a dirty word, and it shouldn't be. And this is not just a semantic dispute, because I think that the way of talking about tribalism as a dis, as a curse that's come upon us, it's not a very helpful way of speaking. It doesn't tell us how to remediate any of the conflicts that might be harming our society or our organizations. And understanding tribal instincts in a more science-based way, it shows us where the levers are, and it shows us how we can lead ourselves by engaging more with our cultures and lead other people by either dialing up or dialing down the activation of particular cultural identities. So we all should become more comfortable with our tribal psychology and more adept at managing it.
Professor Morris, you outlined three core tribal instincts: the peer instinct, the hero instinct, and the etc. instinct. Can you explain
Mm.
each one and how they work together to shape human behavior?
Sure. Um, Social scientists have known for a long time that there are different ways that we sort of internalize the patterns of our groups. And there's lots of abstract words, academic jargon words like descriptive norms versus injunctive norms, uh, institutions, all these long, vague words. And in this book, I had the goal of trying to make this nebulous concept of culture and how we internalize it more concrete, and use language that is easier for people to understand so that we can become more adept at thinking about this and working on culture. And so I named the three major waves of tribal psychology after the reference group that they involve. We we often think of a reference group as like our peer group, as a reference group that we conform to and that we use as a standard when making judgments. But the peers are one reference group, and that's the first major instinct that developed is this instinct to pay attention to peers and to internalize, the ways of our peers, to know what's normal in our group, and to conform to what's normal in our group as a default way of acting and thinking that we can do on autopilot, and it's a sort of socially safe way of operating in order to coordinate with the other people around us, which is a really valuable thing to be able to do. So I call that the peer instinct. And then a second wave of evolution had to do with not just the impulse to be normal, the peer instinct, but the impulse to be normative, the impulse to do the right thing, the impulse to uphold the standards and ideals of the group and to be rewarded for that by the group by gaining status and gaining tribute from other people in the group. And I call that the hero instinct because it essentially is the motivation to be a hero in the eyes of our community. And one way that we learn how to contribute to our group is by watching the people who are the heroes in our community and observing, okay, what's distinctive about these people who have all of this prestige, and then we emulate them. We are sort of wired to emulate the people with the most status and prestige. And that's an adaptive thing because it brings us rewards when we emulate them and we do something that's appreciated. And it also is adaptive for the group because it means that there's a kind of contest going on of everyone who's ambitious trying to contribute to the group to be recognized, and the group benefits from that process, and it leads to a kind of progressive cultural evolution. And then the final one is the one that is most mysterious to people, and that is that in the last 100,000 years, a third wave of evolution that makes our species really distinct is a set of motives to perpetuate the ways of past generations, to kind of keep alive the ways of our ancestors. And that is something that, like conformity and status seeking, it can be irrational. It can be something that leads to superstitious learning or superstitious behavior, but it evolved for a reason. It helps individuals learn from the wisdom of the past. We are very tuned to listening to the elders, to being instructed by the older people when we are younger. We're sort of wired to be ready for that, and we learn by rote when we are learning from elders and learning from the prior generation. We just kind of accept things and replicate them almost blindly. And that helps us learn things that we might otherwise not be able to learn because they are things that may go beyond our understanding, but we just accept them on faith and we replicate them. And what the group benefits from the ancestor instinct is a kind of tribal memory. If all the individuals have this motivation to keep alive the things that they hear about past generations or the things that they learn from artifacts that have survived from past generations, that means that a community is less likely to lose an innovation. And early in human evolution, we can see in the archaeological record that groups would develop something like, say, the throwing spear and have it for many generations, and then they would lose it. And then for like 100 generations, they wouldn't have it. And then they would have to reinvent it again. And once the ancestor instinct became wired into our brains, you don't see that anymore. It's sort of a one-way ratchet effect, that if a group develops a technology, they're very unlikely to lose it because there's this psychological force for keeping alive the knowledge. And so, yeah, those three instincts are things that, different researchers on human evolution and behavioral science have talked about, but I'm trying to label them more concretely and to try to talk about them in a simpler way so that more people can understand them.
Professor, how does understanding our tribal instinct help us make sense of modern challenges like political polarization or workplace dynamics?
Hmm. Well, I think that the important thing that I try to get across in the book is that there's this pundit version of how these conflicts happen, which is that we're wired to hate outsiders, and this kind of hostility for the others is a curse of evolution that will ultimately doom us. And this story I think is unhelpful and inaccurate. But it is the case that some of our tribal instincts, the three instincts I just talked about, the peer instinct, the hero instinct, and the ancestor instinct, they can go awry. They can get caught in feedback loops and operate excessively to the point where they're not leading to adaptive behaviors anymore. But we can understand these dysfunctional dynamics better if we understand them in terms of these science-based tribal instincts rather than this imaginary instinct to hate outsiders. Um, the, it's not very adaptive in terms of evolution to be wired to hate outsiders, to just go around making war with the neighboring group. There was a human species that was wired more that way, which is Neanderthals, and they did go extinct. In the archaeological record, Homo sapiens and Neanderthals lived at the same time, 40 or 50,000 years ago in Europe. And we can see from, archaeological digs of both kinds of sites that the Neanderthals um, they were physically stronger. They even had bigger brains than Homo sapiens. But we can see from the bone scars that they have that they were much more battle prone. They were much more, they had, the average person had many more scars from physical conflict, with neighboring groups. And we also see much more signs of cannibalism, where we see, like a sort of kitchen dump area, outside the living site where you'll see animal bones, but then also human bones with human teeth marks on them, which is pretty telltale evidence of cannibalism. So it's sort of like the Neanderthals and the Homo sapiens had different foreign policies. The foreign policy of Neanderthals was to fight and eat the neighboring group. The foreign policy of the Homo sapiens was to trade with and exchange mates and to exchange ideas with neighboring groups. And it's that latter foreign policy that proved to be adaptive in the long run. So we shouldn't confuse ourselves with Neanderthals. We're not, the very thing that distinguishes our species is the capacity to have productive, intergroup relationships. It's not necessary. It's not inevitable that we will be in conflict with other groups.
Very
Um,
insightful. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, please go
And
ahead,
I
Professor.
and I try in the book to show, I try to diagnose some of the contemporary conflicts and try to show how they arise from the basic tribal instincts and how you can use the levers associated with those instincts to ameliorate the problem. I mean, it's not like they're magic pills that would immediately make these problems vanish, but they show us that these problems are problems that we can work on and that are the kinds of problems that societies have faced in the past and societies have found ways to recover from them. So I think it's almost a kind of narcissism that we tend to think in every generation that civilization is coming to an end under our watch, and it's not. We have conflicts, so did prior generations, but prior generations managed to get over some really, really difficult conflicts, larger conflicts than the ones we're facing today. So I think that we shouldn't be fatalistic and we should try to understand all we can about human nature and accept it and not wish that human nature was different than it is, except that we have these tribal instincts that sometimes go awry and understand what the levers are, what the dials are that we can operate. In the case of the partisan conflict that, in the United States, we have the red tribe and the blue tribe. I know that in India, you have, big divides between the different, is Modi's party the BJP? Is that what it's called? Or, that's a particular party with a particular ideology, and then there are other groups that are very different from that. And there's a tendency when the conflict rises to have partisan blindness, where we start seeing the other side as more different than they really are, or more monolithic than they really are. And I think if we understand that this tendency comes out of the peer instinct, it comes out of our conformist learning, that we tend to learn from the people around us and from the people that we see in the media that we choose. And given that we tend to, more than in the past, we tend to live around people who share the same party, and we tend to consume our news from sources that share the same party, our conformist learning tendencies have put us into this difficult situation now where, in the US, for example, members of the blue tribe, like the people that I'm around most of the time, they live in neighborhoods like the one I live in, where almost everybody is a Democrat, and they get their news from news sources that give you essentially Democratic opinion and not the Republican opinion. And so people feel like they're very well informed because they get more news than they ever did before. But it's news from a narrow subset of the full opinion spectrum. And so people are not that well informed, but very overconfident. And when they hear people from the other side talking, they're completely baffled. Like, how could these people be reaching conclusions that are so different from the conclusions that me and my friends reach? And then the attributions are not always very charitable. We either think, well, these people must be, have cognitive shortcomings, and there were lots of accusations of that during our last election, both sides accusing the other sides of being unintelligent, or they're insincere. They know the truth, but they're not willing to admit it because it serves their interests to pretend something else. And those attributions, I think, are the seed of the hostilities that have been developing in these partisan conflicts. The conflicts don't start from hostility. The hostility emerges from the cognitive gulf that is caused in part by the sorting in our residential communities and the sorting in our news consumptions. And so if we understand it that way, then we know some of the things that we can do. We can move to a neighborhood that's more mixed so that we have more experience of meeting people on the other side. We can consume our news from a greater variety of sources so that we understand the 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 facts that are swaying the other side, the facts that our news channel might not tell us. And we can do things in our lives to try to get outside the bubbles, the partisan bubbles that are causing us to have these encapsulated worldviews.
In Tribal, you highlight the importance of passing on cultural knowledge to future generations. What
Hmm.
can modern organizations or government learn from this approach?
Well, I think that it's an interesting thing. Um, the ancestor instinct is the part of my book that people find most counterintuitive and hardest to understand. One of the key ideas in the book is that, we care so much about traditions, about continuity from past generations, in part because it gives us a kind of solace about our mortality. We are the only animals that know that we will die and that our lives are relatively short and that the end may come in a very arbitrary way. We may be hit by a truck when crossing the street at any time. And so one way that we cope with that, the sort of threat and terror of our mortality, is by wrapping ourselves in cultural traditions that make us feel like we are part of something much more enduring than our narrow individual life. But one of the things that's important for us to believe is that it's not only that our tradition has come many generations in the past, but that it will continue many generations into the future. That sort of faith in our tribal continuity into the future, it's an existential balm that helps us deal with many anxieties. And so we should be sensitive to that and to how it affects people when they feel that the tribal continuity is threatened. When you look at conflicts like in the Middle East, um, there's this tendency to deny the tribal tradition of the other side. There's rhetoric from Israel saying there is no such thing as Palestinian people, and this is a construction, that doesn't have a deep history. And then from the Palestinian side, the Jewish biblical claims to, a continuous presence, in the Holy Land are regarded as folklore, as ancient writings that don't have any historical accuracy. So each side tends to, in order to promote its own narrative about its tradition, they tend to erase the other side's tradition, and that is a really dangerous thing to do. We talk a lot about dehumanization as contributing to violence, but I think detribalization is also very, very inflammatory. And so one way that we can try to de-escalate conflicts between groups is to try to reassure both sides about the continuity of their tribal traditions, that, reassure both sides that their tradition, the history of their tradition is recognized and not disputed, and that a long future is expected, of both traditions. When it comes to, I'm sorry, the question was, you were asking me about some of the conflicts. Maybe follow up the question a little bit and then I'll continue.
Yes. So, in the workplace, tribal instinct can lead to both collaboration and conflict. So, how can leaders harness this instinct to create a cohesive and high-performing teams?
Good. Yeah, yeah. Well, one of the big conflicts in the workplace that is sometimes ascribed to tribalism is the ethnic conflict that happens when you have one group of people, like in my country, perhaps an ethnicity of, white people like myself, who have this bias to be generous and to mentor and to select people who look like members of our clan. And in India, that may exist along the lines of religion, or it might exist along the lines of caste. It's regardless of which social group, it's an unconscious bias you know, towards being generous to the in-group members of your clan. And so the people doing it are not necessarily hostile. It's not necessarily coming out of an exclusionary motive, but it produces discrimination nonetheless. And I think in the US, there's this tendency to explain discrimination and inequality as arising from hostility and efforts to keep the other side down. And then I think what happens is that when that is the narrative, people feel falsely accused. They feel like I'm not hostile to anyone. My motives are only generous. But generosity, if selective, can be just as bad as hostility because it can perpetuate inequality. So we have to recognize that motives that we might think innocuous, like the motive when interviewing someone who reminds you of a younger version of yourself, maybe giving them an extra 10 minutes or giving them the benefit of the doubt about an unclear answer. Well, those acts of giving, unless you're going to extend them to every candidate, become a means of discrimination. And I think if you want to stop discrimination, uh, it's important to know what the real causes of it are. And it's important not to make people feel falsely accused because then they become defensive. And then you often have more polarization as a result of the programs that are designed to eliminate it.
Professor,
Right
yes,
now,
sorry, yeah.
yeah, right now in the new administration in my country, there's this at least verbal rhetoric to try to change what we call DEI programs, which are diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. And it's, making a lot of the people that I hang out with, in organizational behavior programs, very upset and very scared about, that lots of progress will be rolled back. But I think that, we have to grant to the other side that these programs are not perfect and that we have to be open to change because learning happens through a dialectic of, somebody builds something and then somebody tears some of it down and then it gets replaced with some new thing. And a lot of the DEI programs are still anchored on the categories from the Johnson administration in the 1960s. But the demographics of our country have changed enormously since then, and so some of the policies that made sense then don't, it's not taking into account the full diversity of groups in the country nowadays. So I think we have to have some intellectual humility, and we have to understand that evolution is evolution is necessary. Um, I'm sure that some of the same things are happening in India, that you have, maybe one policy trying to tear down some of the programs that were benefiting other groups, and then in some ways that's a step backwards, but in some ways maybe through the process of trying to tear down some of those programs and then replace them, better programs get developed and more up-to-date programs get developed.
Professor, how can individuals become more self-aware of their tribal instincts to navigate personal biases and build better relationships across diverse groups?
Mm. How can we become more aware? I think immersing ourselves in communities that are different from ours, and I think that we in the U.S. at least, liberals, and universities are primarily filled with liberals, so those are my people. We have learned that about, say, ethnic diversity or religious diversity, and we celebrate. We like nothing more than to be at a holiday party where one person is celebrating Hanukkah and another person is celebrating Christmas and somebody else is celebrating Kwanzaa, and we take joy in that cosmopolitanism. And I know from my visits to India that India is an extraordinarily diverse and cosmopolitan place. The source of, four world religions and 50 languages and many, many different ethnic groups, probably the most diverse place on the planet. And so we have learned to celebrate diversity on some lines, but we don't celebrate diversity on partisan lines, political party lines. We openly discriminate against people from the other party. Recent surveys in the US show that Americans are perfectly okay about having their children marry someone of a different religion or a different race, but not of a different political party. Like, people are not okay if they're Democrats marrying a Republican and vice versa. And so that is a new development. That wasn't the case when I was growing up, or when my parents were growing up. So the the uh, the taboo has shifted, and we now make a big taboo about socializing across the lines of political party, and we need to transcend that because it leads to really unhealthy. It's unhealthy for our democracy if we don't know people from the other side of the opinion spectrum, and we don't understand sort of the natives' point of view of what they believe. We only know the caricature that comes from seeing it from outside. So I don't know. How is it in India? Do people socialize and marry across the lines of political parties, or is it the same as in the US where political party has become the new dividing line?
It's a vice versa, basically, in India.
Okay,
Yeah.
interesting.
Professor, my last question. As our world becomes increasingly interconnected, do you think our tribal instinct will evolve further, or will they remain rooted in their current forms?
Yeah, I don't think that the genetics of our tribal psychology are going to evolve much. I think that, we are wired the way we are wired, which means that you know, we expect to live in nested communities. In the old days, you lived in a band that was part of a clan, that was part of a tribe. And now we live in towns that are part of provinces, that are part of countries, and we are simultaneously part of work organizations that are part of industries that are connected to professions. So we live in nested and overlapping groups, many different communities at the same time. And I think that that is unlikely to change, and it's not a problem that we live in multiple groups at the same time. We have to we have to understand that people um, code switch, that depending on the situation they're in, they will be following one set of cultural codes or following another set of cultural codes. And we should become comfortable with this idea that people live suspended between many different cultural communities, and cultures change and evolve partially as a function of the cross-pollination of individuals who move between different cultures. So we shouldn't be threatened by that. It's been the human way for tens of thousands of years, and it will be the human way going forward, I think.
Thank you, Professor Michael Morris, for sharing such profound insights from your book, Tribal, and shedding light on how our tribal instincts can be harnessed as a powerful force for connection, collaboration, and change. Your perspective on reframing tribalism as humanity's misunderstood superpower is both inspiring and thought provoking. To our listeners, we hope this conversation has offered a fresh lens through which to view the groups, organizations, and societies we all part of. As Professor Morris reminds us, understanding and leveraging our tribal instincts can not only help us navigate divisions but also build stronger and more resilient communities. If you'd like to dive deeper into these ideas, I encourage you to pick up a copy of Tribal: How the Primal Cultural Instincts That Divide Us Can Help Us Bring Us Together. Thank you once again, Professor Morris, for joining us today. And to everyone tuning in, stay curious and keep exploring the ideas that shape our world. See you in the next episode. Thank you, Professor Morris.
Thanks very much. And I was going to mention there was a very nice summary of the book in the Times of India a couple of weeks ago. And so if that's something that some of your listeners read, they might enjoy that as well. But I have a website where you can find out about the book and see some of the reviews and the coverage. It's called tribalbook.org. And I have a personal website that talks about my behavioral science research and other things that I do called michaelwmorris.com. So people can start there if they're curious, and if anyone wants to buy the book, it is for sale on Amazon in India, and I would very much appreciate anyone who spreads the word about it.
Thank you, Professor Morris. We will make sure the links of your book and your personal website will be highlighted in the podcast episode on social media.
Great. Thank you so much. I
Yeah.
really appreciate
Thank you,
it. Okay.
Professor Morris.
Okay. Bye.